So today I want to talk to you about some different conceptualizations of Christian spiritual progression. Uh, just a bit of a disclaimer is that there's a lot of different terms that get thrown around in this area, and a lot of these terms maybe overlap or contradict each other, or it's people will refer to the same term but mean two totally different things. So I've tried to give some more precise definitions, and we're going to be going by my definitions in this video. So if you hear about some other person or spiritual leader talking about a similar term in a different way, that's totally fair. Their ideas might be valid. I don't want to say that everything that's called theosis or what have you is wrong. So we just need to be more careful and nuanced about the way we think about it. So another way that I want to make this video like more structured is that I've provided 3 questions or aims that we're going to use to like sort of follow through throughout the video. And the first of these is what are the different theological views on spiritual progression? Secondly, what are some common heresies about spiritual progression? And thirdly, what is the healthy biblical view of spiritual progression and transformation? So we can scroll down here. So here are the 3 main sort of views on spiritual progression. The first one is Theosis. It comes from Eastern Orthodoxy, and the idea is that you become united or attain some sort of likeness to God. Theosis comes from Greek, right? Theo meaning God, sis meaning state. So theosis, Greek for divine state. The famous line from St. Athanasius is used here. It's translated a few different ways. One of them is God was made man so that man could be made God. Theosis also tends to put emphasis on the ladder of divine ascent. So like you move from one virtue to the next as you increase up the ladder, basically. Referencing 2 Corinthians 3:18, where it says that we move into the same image from glory to glory, right? That's sort of picturing that idea of a ladder. The next is Divinization. It's a very similar concept. It comes from Catholicism. Also, at the core of it is becoming united or attaining likeness to God. There's tons of different ways different priests or bishops will explain these different concepts to make them seem similar or different, but there's so many different definitions that they might as well be the same thing, unless I'm missing something. And then we have the Protestant version, which is the idea of sanctification. And the idea here is that you're progressively growing in holiness in the Christian life, and there's a little bit less emphasis on like union with God and more on the image. So the image of Jesus Christ, but of course it all depends on how you phrase it, and different people give different definitions. So overall, these 3 things are very similar, and different variations exist, which makes categorization difficult. Somebody might give a definition of theosis, which another person thinks is actually sanctification or something, right? So it's kind of hard to progress on this front. So when we think about like what we actually mean when we talk about these terms, we have to sort of dig a little deeper. So I want to talk about 2 heresies that people tend to fall into when they're talking about spiritual progression. Okay, and the first is deification, also known as apotheosis. As opposed to theosis, it's apotheosis. And the idea here at the core of deification is that as humans progress on the spiritual journey, they become God or become a God. So that's different from becoming like God or like the image of God or becoming godly. Rather, you become a God in some sense. And the reason this is a heresy is that it erases the creator-creature distinction. So in classical or traditional Christian thought, there's an ontological, ontology being the study of being or the way things are. So there's an ontological distinction between creature and creator. Those 2 things are very different. There's an ontological gap. And deification is a heresy because it sort of erases this gap, right? It says that as humans progress along their spiritual journey, we can participate more and more in God's being, and we become less human and more godlike. And so I have quite a few verses here that can be falsely used to support deification. So these are the same verses, just fleshed out. So Psalm 82:6, I have said ye are gods. John 10:34, Jesus answered them, referencing Psalm 82:6. Is it not written in your law, I said ye are gods? And we'll come back to this, and I'll sort of explain this idea of gods and what that means. So John 1:12 says, to as many as received him, to them he gave power to become the sons of God, which people take to sort of be the same thing, this idea of ye are gods. 2 Peter 1:4, whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these ye might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world. 2 Corinthians 8:9, for ye know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes became poor, that ye through his poverty might be rich. To sort of take this idea of Jesus coming down to become poor so that we can be made rich. So the same idea as St. Athanasius, right? That God became man so we can become God. And then the last one being 1 John 3:2, beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be. But we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And if people are sort of falsely using this to support deification, they're focusing on the part that it says we shall be like him. Okay, now we're going to go into some verses that can sort of be used against deification. So the first of them is Romans 8:29. So it says, for whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son. So the focus here being on image, right? He's not becoming, you're not like becoming Christ, right? You're becoming like the image of Christ. Likewise, in 2 Corinthians 3:18, we see that, but we all, with open face beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, we are changed into the same image from glory to glory. So some translations will translate in a glass as in a mirror. So it's not the thing itself, but it's a reflection of it. So that's a good image or a good metaphor to think about it as well. And then 1 John 3:2, beloved, now we are the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what shall be. This is the same one we read before, except for the emphasis is now on when he shall appear. So this is another theme that we'll touch back on later when we talk about glorification. But it's the idea that we can be made into what the Bible is calling the sons of God here, or what I'll call also like lowercase g gods. But it happens when he shall appear. So this is like at the second coming of Christ, right? We shall be like him. Yeah, not him, but like him. So there's a timing aspect to this as well. And then finally, Philippians 2:13, for it is God which worketh in you. So it's not you that do it yourself. It's God working in you. So another reminder of that. And I also want to go back here and just touch on this Psalm 82:6 idea. And I think I touched on this briefly in my New Age video as well. This idea of ye are gods, and it being sort of like the oldest line in the book from Genesis, Adam and Eve's story, right? So I watched this podcast from a guy named Dr. Michael Heiser, and he explained it like this, the Psalm 82 verse. He said that if you go back and you interpret the Old Testament in the same way that like a first century person would have, or a first century Jew, then you would realize that these people that lived at this time actually did believe in the gods of other cultures. They believed that they were real. They just believed that their God, Yahweh, was bigger and like more powerful and like the true God. And these other gods were sort of like demigods, I guess you could say. And he calls that, Dr. Heiser calls that the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. So therefore the Psalm 82 verse reads that the uppercase G God Yahweh is judging the lesser gods or other spiritual beings, lowercase g gods, of the other cultures. Dr. Heiser then points to several other biblical passages that support this idea. He says it's echoed in Daniel 10:13, where it talks about the princes of the kingdom of Persia, which are generally accepted to be sort of angelic beings, not real people, or humans, I should say. Also, Genesis 6:2 and Job 38:7, where the Bible mentions sons of God, or Bnei Elohim in Hebrew, which are, again, supernatural, spiritual beings, not like humans. Also note that sons of God is different. The language is different in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So those are really the same thing. In the Old Testament, sons of God sort of means this angelic being. So, and it's the same idea in Ephesians 6:12, where Paul is talking about powers and principalities. So sort of the same idea of angelic beings, lowercase g gods. These ones, actually, these lowercase g gods that God is judging in Psalm 82:6 are fallen ones, right? They're not good ones, but they're sort of in this limbo space between humanity and God himself. Excuse me. So, all this is to say, the interpretation of Psalm 82:6 is that there's a difference between lowercase g and uppercase g God, and that when Peter says in 2 Peter that we are partakers of the divine nature, or when Jesus in Matthew 5:48 says, be perfect, the point is that we are remade into what humans were meant to be before the fall, that is, blameless and fit to exist with God in the restored Eden, but that happens at the second coming, not on earth, as it is now. And what this means for the idea of deification is that it's right, but not really. While we do not become God himself, or uppercase G God, God's plan is to make us into these angelic beings or sons of God, lowercase g gods. And this happens when our spirit has been redeemed through Christ. We are still trapped and existing in the flesh for the time being. So we still must struggle against sin and temptation, but later our bodies will also be redeemed so that we can sort of complete this deification process, right, or transformation. So that was a bit long-winded, but now we're going to move on to the second heresy here, which is sinless perfectionism, also known as entire sanctification. And the idea behind entire sanctification is that people can become sinless or perfect while still living on this earth. So it's pretty similar to apotheosis or deification. The difference, though, is that it may not erase the creator-creature distinction. Like some people might argue, I know I'm totally still fully human, but like maybe I can become perfect. And it might sound really biblical, like, oh, well, it's not me that does it, but God actually makes me fully perfect. But they will still argue that it happens while we're still living on earth, as we are now. So, likewise, I have some verses often falsely used in support of sinless perfectionism, so we can go to that now. I'm just going to quickly check my notes here. Yeah, okay, so before we move into the verses, I just had one analogy, so actually we'll go into that when I talk about the verses against it. So, so the first verse falsely used in support is Matthew 5:48. We already talked about it. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. We also have John 8:11. It's talking about the woman caught in adultery. She said, no man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, neither do I condemn ye. Go and sin no more. Sort of implying that, oh, it's possible to sin no more. Of course, is he referring to every possible sin? No, Jesus in this case is referring to a lifestyle. But it can be interpreted the wrong way. Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. All things, including being sinless on this earth, right? You can sort of see how that can be interpreted wrong. And then 1 John 3:6, whosoever abideth in him sinneth not. Whoever sinneth hath not seen him, neither known him. And now moving on to some verses against it. Excuse me. We have 1 John 1:8. This is by far the best proof, I would think. It says, if we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. I mean, that's pretty straight up, right? Next, we have Ecclesiastes 7:20. It says, for there is not a just man upon the earth, that doeth good and sinneth not. Basically, very similar to 1 John. Then we also have Ephesians 2:8-9. For by grace ye are saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. So kind of saying that it's not our sin or lack thereof that saves us. It's a gift from God. Then finally we have 2 Corinthians 4:16. For which cause we faint not, but through our outward man perish, and yet the inward man is renewed day by day. The focus there be on day by day. So it doesn't say our inward man is renewed to the point of perfection. It doesn't say that. It says that we're renewed day by day. It's a continual process, right? So the analogy that I was referring to earlier is, think about sin and perfection as like a first century person going to the river to like bathe and clean themselves. So even as they walk home from the river, their feet get dirty just by walking through the earth, right? Earth by its nature is filthy. And so even though we're born again and our chains to sin have been broken, we're not dead in our sin anymore, we still continue to sin here and there, even if we don't want to, because we exist in a sinful world, and it's impossible to be totally divorced from that. So there's that as well. Where are we now? Yeah, one more thing about sinless perfectionism is like, even if it were possible, which I don't think it is, but even if it were, how would we even know that we were there, right? Jeremiah 17:9 says, "The heart is deceitful above all things." So even if we were able to become sinless, we wouldn't even be able to trust ourselves that we had arrived at that state. The odds would just be astronomically high that we were just blind to our sin and we're being arrogant, right? So, and while we're on the topic of arrogance, I think this idea or like desire for sinless perfectionism to be true is rooted in pride, right? Pride that we think that we can become better than other believers by being sinless. And I don't think the Bible bears that out. So if you feel a pull to believe in perfectionism, you may also be tempted to quote, I talked about that already. So while you might think that sort of like debunking sinless perfectionism is discouraging, I would like to remind you that spiritual complacency in the face of sin is also not biblical, right? So even though we continue to strive for perfection, to be like Christ, even though we cannot attain it in this life, we still have to like be on our guard against it and like do our best to fight it off and attempt to be perfect, even though we can't achieve it in our lifetime. So moving on to the next part of the video, I want to talk about sort of the solution to the two heresies. And this is to be found in the doctrine of glorification. So the idea behind glorification is that believers are made sinless by God, but this does not happen while we're alive. It happens either at the second coming of Christ or upon the death of the believer right before entering heaven. Glorification solves the problem. It solves the problem of deification because it does not remove the creator-creature distinction. And it also solves the problem of sinless perfectionism because it does not occur while we are still living in our present bodies. It only occurs when we receive our spiritual redeemed bodies. So now we're answering our third question here. What is the healthy, proper conceptualization for spiritual progress? And here we've got the 3-step: justification, sanctification, glorification. So I'll just go through it with you. So justification is the act of God declaring a person righteous and forgiven their sins. It's a one-time event that occurs when a person puts their faith in Jesus Christ. The second one is sanctification. So it's the ongoing, lifelong process by which believers are transformed to become more like Christ. It involves the work of the Holy Spirit within a believer, enabling them to grow in holiness, obedience, and conformity to God's will. One of the metaphors that I found on YouTube for Theosis, but I think applies really well in this idea of sanctification, is the analogy of metal in a fire. So if you put a metal, i.e. a believer, into a fire, which is the idea of God's plan and presence, the metal will start to heat up and eventually start giving off light, so that the metal takes on certain characteristics of the fire, right? The metal becomes hot and it gives off light, just like the fire does. But the metal is still metal, it's not the fire, right? So I like this analogy because it maintains the creator-creature distinction, but it sort of shows how the metal is sort of conformed to the image of the fire. So that's good, good way of thinking about it. And then the last one here is glorification. So this is the final stage of salvation that occurs in the future when believers are fully transformed into the likeness of Christ. It takes place at the second coming. Believers will receive new glorified spiritual bodies that are free from sin and the effects of sin. They will be fully conformed to the image of Christ and will dwell in the presence of God for eternity. So yeah, that's like the healthy view of it. So that's sort of all I had here. In summary, we learned some terms: Theosis, Divinization, Sanctification. We learned about a couple of heresies: Deification and Sinless Perfectionism, and sort of some verses pro and con. And then finally, we talked about the proper view of spiritual progression in Justification, Sanctification, and Glorification. So in all, we cannot purify ourselves. We can only be made perfect by and through Jesus Christ, who is the author and finisher of our faith, when we see him in heaven, not on earth. So yeah, thanks for tuning in. See you next time.